Right, welcome to the WPA Evolutionary Psychiatry section webinar series. We had a little bit of a hiatus and we're now back, and we're thrilled to have our speaker, Dr. Gurjot Brar, who is a final year higher specialist trainee doing dual training in general adult and psychiatry of intellectual disability in Ireland. He has recently taken up position of chair of the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group at the College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, and is now a leading figure, I would say, in evolutionary psychiatry worldwide. He retains a lively interest in evolution and psychiatry, and has peer-reviewed publications, several peer-reviewed publications in the field. He's also the founding editor of Evolution and Psychiatry Substack, which can be found on epsig.substack.com. The title of his talk today is Why Evolutionary Science is Helpful for Psychiatry Trainees. So over to you, Gurjot.
Thank you very much, Riyad, for that excellent and very kind introduction. So I'm just going to pop this in the corner there. Yeah. So as Riyad mentioned, I'm going to be talking about why evolutionary psychiatry is relevant and useful for trainees. And it's not just my opinion, it's several others as well. So I'll take you through that. But before, I just want to share why I put this picture up. It might just look like a nice kind of picture to have as your starting slide, but really it's meant to encapsulate how I felt as starting off in psychiatry, and how I sometimes still feel. It's when I can't see the forest for the trees. So you get kind of bogged down in the details with psychiatry. You know what type of psychotherapy, what type of second generation antipsychotic, and you don't quite get to see the fuller picture. So I'm going to argue today, as many of others done, that evolutionary psychiatry is this kind of higher order organizing principle or explanatory kind of framework that can bring psychiatry together, all the disparate kind of bits and bobs that are floating around and out there. So just a few kind of conflicts of interest that I'm just going to share. I'm not sure if they are, but I'm doing an MD at the moment at the University of Limerick in evolutionary psychiatry and medical education. And as Riyad mentioned, I'm the editor of the Evolution and Psychiatry Substack, and I receive a very nominal annual fee. I recently took up chair of the EBSIG in Ireland, and I was appointed secretary of the Evolutionary Psychiatry section of the World Psychiatry Association. So before I move into the talk, I just want to take a moment and express my gratitude to several prominent figures in the field, particularly Henry, who without I wouldn't have entered the field. I wouldn't even know anything about evolutionary psychiatry, and all the lovely colleagues that I was able to meet along the way, who welcomed me with open arms, particularly Riyad and Paul, really welcoming and really encouraging me to explore my own ideas and others, and really treat me almost as an equal, which is saying a lot. So I also want to thank Annie, who's been fantastic and is really an incredible brain, and we're lucky to have her in the field. And of course, Randy, who's kind of known as the father of evolutionary psychiatry. And there's many more I'd like to thank, but I can't. But if you see yourself in the picture, consider yourself thanked. So my talk, the outline is, first, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to EP. Many of you listening already already familiar with it, but I'd like to give you kind of my own spin on it and my own little journey. I won't get too bogged down in the details. And then the bulk of the talk is what the data shows in terms of why evolutionary psychiatry is useful and relevant, particularly for trainees, but for any physician really, in medicine, so evolutionary medicine as well. And then just a little bit on the next steps and future directions and where things are going in this particular avenue in the field. So here's a brief overview. So here's the best definition from Nessie and Stein. The subfield of evolutionary medicine that uses the basic science of evolutionary biology to better understand and treat mental disorders. That's a nice, succinct definition that I like to use. And evolution, of course, is defined as the gradual development of plants, animals, etc., over many years as they adapt to changes in their environment. And it's almost like an unspoken rule amongst us that you can't have a lecture or a slide, a bunch of slides without including a Dobzhansky quote, such as "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Despite all this, evolution is largely neglected in mainstream psychiatry and in medical education more generally, which is a great shame, really. How I like to think of it is it's not trying to replace anything. If anything, it's seeking to add a complementary dimension to mainstream psychiatry by integrating evolutionary science. So I like to think of mainstream psychiatry kind of, having spent too much time in the library and needs to come out back into the open and really get to see the whole picture and see how everything fits together. So it is a little bit difficult to explain. So I did turn to ChatGPT here, and he gave me a kind of caveman style poem, if you will. The brain made for old world, new world different, brain confused. Sometimes feelings go too big or too small that make mind problems. So it's obviously just humorous, but it's the concept of mismatch is quite neatly in there. So here's a little quiz you can take at home if you're listening. So if you agree with each of them, you're definitely an evolutionary psychiatrist, just like me. So the first one is we'd say, if you agree we descended from apes, you agree that our brains, just like the rest of us, evolved over deep time. And if so, you agree that psychiatric symptoms stem from the brain. And also you agree, therefore, evolution interacts somehow with psychiatric symptoms. Now, I'm not saying I know exactly how it interacts, but at least you agree that there is an interaction there. So here I've included another Dobzhansky quote. So it's not just that first quote. This one Annie gave to me actually, and she said it would be a really good one to include, because if you swap out biology here and put psychiatry and science and specialty, it fits really, really well. Seen in the light of evolution, psychiatry is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring specialty. So I know a lot of us who are psychiatrists feel that already. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. So again, this is the same thing I've been talking about. How does the various types of psychotherapy fit in with neurotransmitters at the receptor level? How does that look at the social determinants of health and so on? Like, how do we fit that all together? Recently, there's been an increased interest and an awareness of EP, which has been steadily growing, which started off at the Royal College in the UK with the efforts of Riyadh and Paul and others. Similarly, in Ireland, Henry O'Connell founded the EPSIC there, and then I joined a few years later. And also, our section in the World Psychiatry Association has been increasing its prominence and we're hopefully due to present in a few different symposia at the next meeting in Stockholm. And then the next question I get usually it's where can I learn more and what do I read first? And the first thing I usually point people towards is Nessie's book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings. Many of you are probably familiar with this book already, but it really it toes the line between accessible and scientific really well. And then if you're looking for something a bit meaty, the Evolutionary Psychiatry Current Perspectives on Evolution and Mental Health, Cambridge University Press book, this edited volume by Riyad and Paul is fantastic and by far the go-to book to pick up. And then if you're looking for more of a paper, a technical paper, I'll refer you to Nessie's Evolutionary Psychiatry Foundations, Progress and Challenges, which was published in the World Psychiatric Journal. Excellent article. Okay, so just moving on, another thing that people include in their talks often is Tim Bergen's 4 questions. And the reason it features so heavily in introductions of evolutionary psychiatry is because it's just a really easy and nice way to make sense of what we're going to be talking about, really. So in mainstream psychiatry, you can think of the proximate explanations taking the kind of foreground. And if you're looking at, for example, anything that's transmitted genetically, you could look at the ontogeny. So how does the trait develop in individuals or this particular individual over time? And what's the proximate mechanism, which neurotransmitter is involved, which receptor is involved, or what's the structure of this trait? And then what evolutionary science or psychiatry is seeking to add is the evolutionary kind of angle, which is what's this trait's evolutionary history. So going all the way back, how far can we go back and how far can we extrapolate information about this particular trait? Similarly, does this trait hold any adaptive significance? And were there any variations of this trait that influence fitness in different environments? And how does that impact the presentation that you're seeing in your patient today, for instance? So another question that kind of struck me, we're always talking about serotonin and dopamine every single day in psychiatry, and we're prescribing medication that interact with these neurotransmitters. Yet we know very little about them. We may know a little bit from textbooks that we've read, but for example, we don't know how old, we don't know the history of serotonin and dopamine, and essentially they're neurotransmitters, and they're millions and millions of years old, and they've been present in all types of life forms, including early jellyfish. But the point here is that serotonin and other neurotransmitters are just they're just acceptations. The roles that they inhabit now within us are acceptations, in terms of regulation of mood, for instance. You'd be hard pressed to find any psychiatric trainee or even most consultants who would know, how to explain the neurotransmitters in this sense. So again, what I'm arguing is, you've probably guessed that mainstream psychiatry focuses only on the tip of the iceberg, and most of the iceberg remains neglected. For example, in say you're doing cardiology, the first thing you'll learn, if I could take you back to med school, is you'll learn how the heart works. So you'll understand the physiology of the heart, and then you'll learn different heart disease and so on, and how to treat. We don't really start with the physiology of mood, physiology of anxiety, etc. We don't really have a sense of that. We know the pathophysiology, or we know the pathology or the psychopathology. We don't really know physiology. That's how can we hope to have a broad and complete understanding unless we include that within our knowledge? So one article I want to highlight, which I think, in my opinion, is landmark here, is the Evo Biopsychosocial Medicine article, which put forth this model. And this was Adam, Paul, and Riyad, and they essentially, I'd recommend you go read the whole paper. But they looked at a few different case studies, and one of them was depression. And essentially, this half of the table, you can imagine, is your mainstream kind of view and what we know already. So we know the biopsychosocial model, which was originated by Engel in the 70s. I'm not sure even he intended it to persist to this day, but yet we continue with it, and we have proximate mechanisms here. So, for example, this is something that we all know. On the biological sense, we have the serotonergic system, psychological processes such as rumination, social phenomena such as bereavement, and any of these or all of these could be in a presentation of depression. Similarly, with development, one can be more susceptible or less susceptible to depression. Similarly, with attachment problems, and also chronic stress and kind of social milieu that exists in the person's life that could be maintaining depression. So this is where we are at the moment. This is where we've been since the 70s, really. We haven't really progressed much. So what I think, and what Adam, Paul, and Riyad evidently think, is that the evolutionary angle just adds so much more information. And here we can look at the biological function. So we can think about the function of, say, serotonin, and we can think about how it affects the other places in the body, the gut, the heart, the reproductive system. And we can predict side effects of drugs. We can also predict, how we may treat depression through the gut. For example, there's emerging data that is a possibility. And then whether there's adaptive cognition dysfunction or there's harmful functions. This can lead to subtyping of depression, which can inform different types of therapy. As we know, two patients with depression, can have very different forms of depression. And similarly with ancestral social environments shaping functional psychological traits. So how are these? How is this mismatched with the presentation today? And then phylogeny, so looking at kind of shared neurotransmitter pathways with other species. So identifying kind of homology with other animals, and this thing kind of focused animal model for drug testing. Similarly, with psychological and behavioral correlates, so a lot of the kind of primatology work that's happening, and then social situations which trigger analogous states. So, for example, the hierarchy status in primates. So you can see this whole table is enriched with data, within which to explore something, as common as depression. So a little bit more about why evolution can predispose us for illness. So these three are probably the things to remember if you're new to the field. So evolution is very slow. It takes a lot of time for traits to develop. It's imperfect as well, and there can be trade-offs and constraints. It can't do, for example, it can't bend the laws of physics. And evolution, and this is the most important one, I think, for psychiatry, is it's not interested in our happiness. So often we'll get patients who present to us saying, I just want to feel happy again. I just want to be happy. I just want to, and you sympathize because you know the human condition, but happiness is never the goal for evolution. And then there are other reasons for illness. So mismatch is the one that's probably the most popular, and this is very easy to show in diseases of kind of, of obesity, diabetes, that sort of thing. So we haven't evolved to live in with such hyper palatable food and for example high alcohol content and so on. But there's much more to mismatch than just that. Similarly with infection as well, evolutionary constraints, trade-offs as well. For example, calcium deposition, good for strong bones, bad for small arteries in the heart. Evolution optimizes for reproduction, and then there's defensive reasons as well. So I'm not going to go too much into detail there. There are other reasons as well. Some of you probably come across these as well with life history factors. For example, fast and slow life history, sexual selection, and how that and that this is often quite a neglected part of psychiatric formulation, and balancing selection that occurs in mechanical with psychosis, demographic history, and how that impacts the presentation, and obviously extremes of adaptation. So most traits distribute normally, and then there will always be extremes. Okay, so I think they're potentially useful in assessment, diagnosis, psychoeducation, and even direct clinical applications. So, reducing kind of stigma and normalization, psychoeducation, even forms of kind of rudimentary psychotherapy. The evolutionary explanations can serve as kind of therapeutic modalities in themselves. For example, the smoke detector principle from Nessie, and potentially prevention strategies, which haven't been fully explored. And zooming out further, you can look at how these perspectives may inform genetics and research, their destigmatizing effects, how they can make more persuasive doctors and less disillusioned doctors. Interestingly, we could explore how the placebo effect comes to be, and why it is so effective, and why does it create so much noise in random controlled trials. So there's lots there. So I'm going to go into what the data shows now. So this is kind of the main part of the talk here. So I'm going to take you through a couple of kind of conceptual editorials and kind of papers that map curriculum and what's already out there. So with a medical education focus, this paper was written by Riyad and colleagues, arguing that evolutionary biology should be an essential basic science for the training of the next generation of psychiatrists. So this is a fundamental view that many evolutionary psychiatrists have, and for good reason. Moving beyond that in Ireland, and with some UK colleagues, we wrote why we believe evolution to be the bridge between biological and social psychiatry. So there is this artificial divide, which is misleading, unhelpful, and ultimately a false one. And we propose here that the evolutionary perspective provides a necessary framework that can kind of bridge the two together. It's not just us in the UK and Ireland, it's in the States. Other authors have been arguing for the same. It can facilitate higher level thinking and reasoning in medical training. And looking at Bloom's taxonomy in medical education, for those who are familiar, the integration of knowledge across various fields is possibly the highest level order thinking. And evolutionary science and evolution medicine can be that meta theory that really ties everything together and allows students and trainees to really think on a higher level. This is a slide just to say that I've been working on a scoping review and looking at where we are really with in medical education, evolutionary psychiatry, medicine, and medical education. So I've been looking at studies since the 1990s across kind of 5 databases. So I've done the review. I'm in the process of writing it up, but I can share with you some preliminary findings. So some of the findings. So within medicine, we know that evolutionary perspectives clarify why vulnerabilities persist and their adaptive functioning, and also how modern environments can shape morbidity. But despite all of this relevance that is there, these perspectives remain underrepresented in medical and psychiatric education. And there's limited integration of evolutionary biology in medical curricula, despite medicine itself being a biological, being from a biological framework. Barriers such as crowded curricula and limited faculty expertise are usually the reasons that are cited and constrain implementation. Despite this, it's supported by very strong conceptual frameworks, growing advocacy, and the potential to reduce stigma and an increasing number of structured teaching initiatives. So there's a lot of conceptual stuff there. I'm going to move on to a small study that I did um, following a kind of national conference in Ireland, and it was a kind of small symposium on ADHD. And one of the talks was Annie's talk on ADHD, and we had several psychiatrists joining us, to the point where we had to go and ask for more chairs, and people were standing at the back. So it was very, very well attended, and we had over 42 participants who took part in the study. And some of these questions were fairly rudimentary. Again, we're just piloting whether these perspectives could be useful, and do they feel that it could enhance their clinical interactions with their patients. And as you can see, most kind of strongly agreed or agreed, and very few disagreed. I'm just going to talk very briefly about this study, because I know Adam and Tom have already probably spoken about it in other areas, but we are especially proud of this one. We're still buzzing from the results. So this is essentially what happened was over 170 psychiatrists and trainees received a 30-minute presentation, and it was either a genetic explanation or an evolutionary explanation. It was multi-site, so across the UK and Ireland, and it was blinded, and it was pre-registered on OSF. So, probably one of the highest quality studies in terms of kind of not only medical education, but thinking about how evolutionary explanations can potentially impact clinical outcomes. So here, the findings were robust evidence that framing anxiety through an evolutionary lens can be a powerful tool to foster more optimistic and destigmatized perspectives compared to a genetic explanation. So in particular, clinicians overwhelmingly rated evolutionary explanations of anxiety as highly useful in comparison to genetic explanations. So this is in preprint. You'll probably find it online, but it's probably soon to be published as well. So that's kind of what's been happening in our local community in the UK and Ireland. But really, there's been talk of this in psychiatry since 1994, as you can see, by Baptista here in Venezuela, who in this paper outlined essentially how to teach evolution in psychiatry, and how he gave a whole kind of framework on how to do it, what works, what doesn't. what should be included. So kind of one of the first kind of curriculums, I guess you can say, um, of teaching evolutionary psychiatry. Later on, much later on, him and his colleagues conducted a study where they taught to psychiatrists and other medical specialists and medical students. And what they did here was they did a pilot of a pre and post study of a 2-hour interactive seminar on evolutionary theory. So again, it wasn't just psychiatrists, but it was a few others, including medical students. And baseline self-rated knowledge of evolutionary topics was low, moderate across all groups, unsurprisingly. But it improved significantly after the seminar, which shows that even brief teaching can boost perceived understanding. Psychiatrists, however, showed smaller gains on several items and rated the relevance of evolution to their work lower than other specialties. So this is another thing that really the data doesn't capture. A lot of psychiatrists can be a little bit resistant because they don't see the obvious benefit to the patient in the clinic. It can take a little bit of convincing, or it can take a little bit of that that particular psychiatrist who's on the fence to go on their own educational journey to learn a little bit more about evolutionary theory and why it could be relevant. But it was just an interesting finding here. It hasn't been found anywhere else, but it does show up from time to time and anecdotally when discussing with other colleagues. So moving on to the States, this study looked at the status of evolutionary medicine education across all of North America. And it was fantastic. So they didn't get as many respondents, but they did try and canvass the whole country. So they got 60, which I think is pretty good. The deans of these 60 schools rated EVMED concepts like antibiotic resistance, mismatch, etc. as important. But despite how many of these rated it being important, whether they actually included it in their curriculum lagged behind an average of 21%. And the major barriers again was I don't have anybody who can teach it, and teaching evolution in America can sometimes spark controversy. And this seems to be a uniquely American phenomena, as far as I can tell. In the States, they've been very busy, particularly with Randy setting up the Center for Evolution and Medicine in the Arizona State University. So this paper looked at the state of evolutionary medicine in undergraduate education, and it did a deeper dive, really. So instead of just speaking to the deans, they went into the course catalogs of almost 200 institutions, and then they surveyed about 50 or more, just over 50 of those instructors. And what they found was at research-intensive universities, or just over half offered a dedicated EVMED course, while smaller universities that only offered a bachelor or master's, only 2%. That kind of makes sense. Most courses were housed in biology or anthropology departments. So you can imagine in these places, if you were a med student, you would go further afield to get your evolutionary medicine training, which is a little bit strange. But you'll have professors of biology or anthropology teaching you. But I think this is just limited by having faculty in medical schools familiar with evolutionary medicine. And then instructor backgrounds and disciplines significantly influence how these principles were emphasized. So they continued their work, and they did a Delphi study. This is one of my favorite papers because they arrived at 14 core principles of evolutionary medicine. So they kind of went through and iteratively created this beautiful table of 14 essentially learning outcomes or learning objectives, really. These core principles that can be applied across the board globally, essentially. And many experts were consulted on this. And for example, you can look at, for example, trade-offs here, and they're defined very well as well. Evolutionary changes in one trait that improve fitness can be linked to changes in other traits that decrease fitness. Or for example, mismatch. Disease risks can be altered for organisms living in environments that differ from those in which their ancestors evolved. So I highly recommend you go read this or check this table out for yourself, because it's a very high quality study, and it probably took a lot of work and a lot of refinement, and I can say it probably took a lot of time to refine this into a gem that it is today. And then they didn't stop there. They kept going and they developed a EVMED assessment, which again is another beautiful piece of work, which is a test for measuring student understanding of core concepts. So it's based on these 14 core principles. So they took the core principles and they made a nice assessment. So it's 6 core questions with 25 items each, and then 5 supplemental ones also. So this covers medicine, and they included a set of questions and items that on psychiatry as well. So this is the one that they included. It's a nice template that we can go through today. So if you're at home today and you feel like testing yourself, here's a good opportunity. So I'm just going to read out what it is, and then maybe you can choose whether you think it's likely or unlikely. So humans vary in their frequency and severity of anxiety they experience. Some have GAD, which is characterized as excessive anxiety and worry about various events or activities. Most experience a moderate amount, while some experience none at all. Over the past several decades, the number of individuals with GAD has increased. Okay, so do we think it's likely or unlikely that individuals who never experience anxiety have higher fitness than those who experience anxiety in moderate amounts? Okay, the next one is generalized anxiety disorder is a useful adaptation. The next one is theoretically natural selection will result in disorders of too much anxiety more often than disorders of too little anxiety. And the last one is the increase in the number of individuals with GAD over the past several decades is being driven by natural selection. Okay, so I have the answers on this slide, and you can see how you did. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but you can see how this might be a useful tool for medical students, and they have tons of these questions which have been aligned with the core principles to cover most of medicine. Okay, so evolutionary medicine is a global thing. So it's not just the UK, Ireland, and North America. We are seeing, we're seeing activity in Germany quite a lot, and we're seeing some activity in Pakistan. And it's not just medical students in the field of nutrition and dietetics. And people have found evolutionary medicine a useful thing to explore. And it has been, I actually haven't been able to include everything, but there's much more there, which I will include in the scoping review. There are more studies that have come out, and it really is a global thing that's occurring. So the next steps and future directions. I'm doing this MD, and I will be publishing my data. So, but the first part of that is the scoping review. Our collected workshop data as well, which is a mixed method. So this is psychiatrists, so few medical students, mostly trainees, and a few consultants. And I'm analyzing through the data, almost finished actually. And I'm doing a lot of work on medical students at Trinity College, Dublin, and the University of Limerick. And I'm doing a pre and post study following Henry O'Connell, who gives a talk to each rotation of medical students in psychiatry. And I'm doing a kind of a cross-sectional study on all medical students about their acceptability of evolution in general, and their kind of knowledge, attitudes, and kind of beliefs. That's progressed a little bit more than just data collection. And then the whole idea is bringing this together into curriculum reviews and proposals for the colleges of psychiatry and for the universities, to see how can we include this without contributing to the curriculum bloat that's often cited. And then I just want to point you towards a few resources that are out there. This is the Royal College EP SIG main page, where I think you can join if you're anywhere in the world, but definitely if you're in the UK, you should join. And they have a YouTube page which has an incredible amount of useful videos and some highly eminent speakers. So I recommend you check that out. We here in Ireland have a page as well in our College of Psychiatrists of Ireland, and we have a YouTube page as well where we publish all our videos that we have. Similarly, we have some nice speakers who give really interesting talks, and then Adam Hunt, who many of you already know, runs the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, who I listen to religiously. I think you should too. This is very good to just put on, and it's a nice introduction into an aspect of evolutionary psychiatry. And then I'd just like to talk a little bit about my Substack that I started with Henry here. We have tons and tons of articles, and it's really evolved, mind the pun, into something which is very accessible to the public, but also retains a certain level of rigor and kind of fact checking. And it has been very useful. I've been able to recommend this to all types of people from all types of backgrounds, and people have come and told me that they've been able to recommend it to other people as well, including patients who found some of this stuff quite useful, and particularly the clinical case series. I believe there's 12 in total, so there's each on the major kind of mental disorders, but it's been a very a popular series. And so I just want to mention here that we started off quite small, very few subscribers, probably just me and Henry and our parents, and then it steadily grew, and now we've actually got well over 3,000 subscribers, and even more followers, and it's been a really fascinating journey to explore evolutionary psychiatry kind of principles and conversations. We have a kind of primer on what evolutionary psychiatry is, so that's a nice place to start. And this is our most read and most popular article about the hypercuriosity theory of ADHD. And one thing I want to highlight here is this is a very well put together theory which looks at potential ways in which the theory could be wronged, how it is falsifiable, how it can be testable, etc. So it's a good test. It's a good template for even how to write a paper on a theory. So yeah. So the QR code may not work if you're watching the recording. So please just go to epsig.substack.com if you'd like to subscribe there. You've seen the other resources. If you'd like to email me, that's my email there. You can also reach me on Twitter or X. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Gurjot. Just want to read this quote that to start our discussion that I came across. One of the barriers, it seems to me, that mainstream psychiatrists put against evolution is that it's too theoretical and not practical enough. And this quote is from a chap called Robert Millikan, who was got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1924. And he said in his address in accepting the Nobel Prize, said, "Science walks forward on 2 feet, namely theory and experiment. Sometimes it is 1 foot which is put forward first, sometimes the other. But continuous progress is only made by the use of both, by theorizing and then testing, or by finding new relations in the process of experimenting and then bringing the theoretical foot up and pushing it on beyond, and so on in an unending alteration." So I think that psychiatrists and probably doctors in general, but our concern as psychiatrists, should pay attention to the fact that the scientific enterprise does not work with data alone, does not work with experimentation alone, and it's not without theory. Meaningful questions can't be asked. So one of the things that I would want to put to you, Gurjot, is how do you feel? Because we don't seem to be breaking through in a major way into mainstream psychiatry, because we are accused of being too theoretical. What is the way forward to break into mainstream psychiatry and convince our colleagues that this enterprise is worthy of attention, and that evolutionary psychiatry is the true biological psychiatry? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a question I turn to quite a lot. It's something that I've been scratching my head about for a while. I think when it comes to getting it on the mind of trainees and consultants, it really has to be in the curriculum. And this is just the unfortunate truth of things. Clinicians end up being very busy. There's a lot on the curriculum already. There's a lot involved in training and the job. Unless it's mandatory, people have a tendency to not engage, or let's say it takes a lot more motivation or interest, sometimes external interest, for them to engage. So really, if we can get some form of evolutionary psychiatry into the curriculum, I think that'll be our best bet for growth. And in that sense, it needs to be made explicit in the assessment framework. and then it will be made into curriculums and learning outcomes and so on. This is the kind of one of the legs of that I'm involved in is trying to get this out there and convince those who are in charge of designing curriculums that it is a worthy endeavor to include this, and it will not further weigh down the curriculum. It will make it more integrative. That's the idea. The other angle is the public angle. So if we can include public, include the public in wanting this type of education for their future clinicians, for their future doctors, and, if they can advocate for that somehow, or whether we start to look at applying some of what we've learned into public health. I know someone once said, I can't remember who said it now, Riyad, maybe you'll help me, but essentially what we're talking about here is more about behavioral ecology, and it would be more well suited to have public health interventions with the type of theories that we have. I don't know. Maybe you could tell me more. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Janine, who you want to quote and you've forgotten the name of, or
perhaps, or just the idea itself, let's say.
No, the idea. I agree. I mean, evolution is, on the whole, more relevant to populations than individuals. So it's not. It may be considered as not directly relevant to an individual patient in the clinic, but that can be said about all basic sciences. This is not unique to evolution. I mean, just going on an aside, you will be aware, because I sent to all the symposium participants we did a submission to the College Congress for 2026, and the symposium that I proposed, which I wasn't a speaker in, but you were one of the speakers, Gurjot, and so was Costa and Tom Carpenter, and I think Reem was the chair, and it was turned down. It was rejected by the committee, and the reason they gave was that because it wasn't sufficiently clinically relevant. Well, I mean, it is a symposium about training and about the relevance of evolution to medical training. So I don't know exactly. So are they gonna omit genetics and epidemiology because they're not directly clinically relevant? Of course not. They're going to keep those, but I think it's a convenient, seems to me, a convenient reason that they give us every year for rejecting our symposia, on the basis that it's not directly clinically relevant. So, which is why I thought I would read that quote to you from that Nobel laureate in physics. Go ahead, Adam.
Thank you, Riyad, and thank you, Gurjot, for a wonderful presentation and also really interesting work that you're engaged in. I'm really looking forward to seeing what your scoping review comes out with, and just having one publication which I can look to kind of summarize that state of the field. That's going to be really invaluable. So I think maybe just to follow up on the points that we're talking about in terms of how to convince the establishment that there is some value here, is we are kind of lacking in good empirical evidence that, well, on a couple of fronts. I think that you could maybe think about the explanations themselves, the theories, although they're very interesting. We don't have really solid evidence of from, for instance, anthropology of what the schizophrenics and the autistics and the ADHD people are doing. There's some really interesting hypotheses with kind of evidence that we can put together, but it's not as solid as, or it just definitely doesn't seem as solid as many of the our competing scientific theories. So I understand why there's that problem, but then also perhaps even more importantly is evidence of improvement of outcomes, right? I mean, you kindly mentioned the study that you were involved with, that Tom was involved with, that we organized over the last 3 years, kind of studying how evolutionary explanations of anxiety impact clinicians. And I saw that as that was an important study to run to show that there could be some value here, and that clinicians around the UK and Ireland agree that evolutionary explanations of anxiety actually do seem to have a lot of potential. The next step is to take it to the clinics and actually show that patients improve, that people are comforted, that families are comforted, to actually to translate that kind of clinical perspective into the improvement in outcomes, which is ultimately what psychiatry cares about. And I think if we have a couple of those studies, then maybe we'll have a foot in the door, hopefully. But it's before those exist, then we could just be we're just another interesting perspective, and why does this matter? So I think that this is something that we can work on, and it's something that we are working on, and we're setting the foundations, and then hopefully we'll be able to kickstart studies, because we can look at all sorts of disorders, and this is actually where I want to kind of come on to as a sort of question to you, and maybe open the discussion about, it's like, where do we start? Because say that we want to be studying a particular, just the constraints of science are such that we would want to kind of look at, for instance, anxiety or ADHD or postnatal depression. I know that our group here is actually having some really positive feedback about our postnatal depression, and actually Anais Swanepoel is working with my supervisor here, Nikhil Chowdhury, on translating evolutionary perspectives on postnatal depression to improving perspectives from mothers, and they're having wonderful feedback, very positive feedback, very optimistic about that. So yeah, assuming that we have to pick some disorder or some kind of explanation, which one do we go for first? And then I also have a follow-up question of, like, which is also a kind of a specific question of what type of education do we do first? Like, are you thinking kind of early med school? There's like, and how many lectures? I don't know if you've thought about how long it would take, because we've spent years, well, I've spent years, Riyad's definitely spent years, and you've spent years kind of thinking about this stuff. But I'm wondering, when you're thinking about selling it to medical schools, how much do we need to put in, and what would be kind of the bare minimum versus the optimal versus, so these are the 2 points that I'd like to discuss.
That's great. I'm going to answer your second question first, if that's okay. So what I've looked at here is, and what the work in the States and Randy's team have been quite good with, is developing the EdMed assessment tool. And through that tool and the core principles, we can work on embedding this somehow across, obviously we could start in psychiatry, but I think evolution, like looking at the medical curricula as a whole. And for example, say we just want to do psychiatry. The psychiatry features in almost every year in some aspect, and it could just be adding just a little bit at each of those points, just to anchor the student's thinking in a wider kind of evolutionary frame, rather than just the kind of proximate mechanisms. Looking at, for example, mismatch is a really easy sell. I think mismatch, you look at trade-offs. So any of these kind of core principles, you can embed, say, 3 or 4 of them across psychiatry, the most relevant ones, and link them to a disorder. And then you link them to something. For example, in family medicine, you would see depression, you would see anxiety. So those are the easy kind of low-hanging fruit. And you could kind of incorporate those principles. So, for example, on a problem-based learning, lesson, you could do 1 or 2. And this kind of feeds into the clinical cases that Henry has written, and I've helped edit, and they're on the Substack. It just helps you to create an additional frame onto what's already happening, or even ask a slightly different question at the end, of something. Now, will it be easy? Probably not, and I don't know, like each university has their own way of doing things. There's no kind of standardized way, but working with the colleges, it might be a little bit easier. Yeah, so again, it's a work in progress. Like, I'm still thinking about it, but embedding in a PBL environment from years kind of 1 to 4 or 5 is probably the way forward. One question, one learning outcome at a time. And then I think the bulk of the learning is always going to be optional. It's going to be these optional EvMed courses that are sold in kind of biology and anthropology departments for those medical students who are really interested. We're not going to get everybody interested. So if we get that fraction interested and they go on to kind of incorporate into their thinking even more, that would be the best outcome. So the first question you mentioned, which was like, what kind of disorder do we target first? In my opinion, I don't think that's the way to look at it. I think the way we need to look at it is backwards. So we look at interventions first. And there are many interventions out there which have evolutionary kind of thinking or reasons behind them, so I've been kind of toying with this idea of mismatch reduction therapy, and I've spoken to Riyadh about it. Adam may have spoken to you about it too. And it essentially, you'd be recruiting any type of outpatient, who's well enough to complete a 6-week kind of course, and there's a mixture of occupational therapy, some kind of basic psychotherapy, this kind of stuff, social work perhaps, rehabilitation psychiatry. It's incorporating elements of these, and a lot of the studies have already been done on why you should sleep. Try and aim for 8 hours of sleep. Why you shouldn't have screens 1 hour before bed. All of these things. All the stuff that's popularized by like Huberman and Matt Walker for sleep. You can incorporate all these insights into one manualized therapy framework. And ultimately, the person can do it themselves if they choose to, but it's probably going to be more effective if you have kind of group work or whatever. And the group work facilitates kind of social kind of cohesion and bonding and hierarchy and blah, blah, blah. So there's multiple levels in which we can make this, I guess, evolutionarily relevant, but also like without doing many studies ourselves and trying to prove that, let's look at sleep, let's look at depression, then we're just integrating, and here are these outpatients who are well enough to complete a 6-week course, and we're going to chuck them in, and then we're going to look at standardized psychometrics that every psychiatrist could look at and go, oh, look, there's an HAM-D or it matters, or PHQ even for the family medicines. So it's an idea I've been toying with. I'll hope to develop it in the future. It will need funding and a lot more collaboration, I would say, but I think it has some legs.
So yeah, just to like explore this, because I think it's a really interesting idea, and it kind of fits this conceptually. It's like it's like a course of therapy. Like now you would have whatever 6 weeks of CBT, or whatever 3 months of CBT, or 2 months of CBT. But you're saying that, okay, but it's 2 months of EBT or whatever, EIT, and it wouldn't just be like talking to a therapist. It would be kind of behavioral interventions as well.
Yeah.
Which obviously CBT does, to some extent, but you're thinking of like a kind of a course, which then you can have like the start, the end, you measure on various metrics, and you can apply across disorders, and generally you might see improvements, and it'll be interesting to test. Yeah, it's a cool idea.
It is. I just want to mention the 3 of our colleagues are writing books on the whole issue about mismatch and health. Paul Goldsmith, who's a neurologist, is publishing his book. I think it's going to be released in February. I think sometimes middle of February. Paul Keedwell, who's a psychiatrist, has also written a book, and that's been accepted now by Cambridge University Press. And that is also about more focused on mental health. So it's mismatch and mental health. And there's a third book that has been accepted by Cambridge University Press and will be released, I think, later this year. And that is by Markus Rantala in Finland and Severi Luoto, who's also Finnish but is based in Australia. And that is focused on depression, but it's focused on depression and mismatch. They discuss the concept of looking at treatments beyond the traditional treatments into into lifestyle, into context, into the environment, and so on and so forth, but focused on depression. So I think that this idea is gaining traction. This whole business of looking at mismatch and its effect on health, and the fact that it lends itself not only to individual intervention, but actually public health, wider sort of public health interventions. I think Paul Goldsmith takes the wider public health, and so does, I think, to a large extent, Paul Keedwell. But Markus Rantala takes both. The implications for individual therapy, as well as sort of more public health, wider measures that can be based on mismatch, but focused on depression.
And absolutely, and like the idea that I've been talking about, you would measure physical health kind of biomarkers, and unsurprisingly, you would probably see a reduction in BMI and so on. So I'm sure you can't have an intervention which is, solely aimed at mental health. It will impact physical health too in a positive way, hopefully. So I think, the future will be kind of this kind of integrated medicine where interventions, people will be suitable in lots of different ways, because depression does affect you physically, and so does schizophrenia and everything. So it makes sense to have interventions which target multiple, which target mental and physical health. I'll definitely keep an eye on those books.
Yeah,
I've read some of Rantala's work already.
one of them is going to be published in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd love to collaborate more on this in the future, and then maybe if I can secure some funding and I think it's an easy study to do, especially a pilot study. You could easily recruit 20 or so individuals for 6 weeks, and get them to do something similar to what is already being done, but it's just not being done together. And you could recruit an OT, maybe a psychologist, or a nurse therapist to complete, and then one of the interventions may be that, I think I was speaking to somebody, I think Leith, who's giving me some tips. He was like, make sure you have an arm which includes an evolutionary explanation at the beginning, and another arm that doesn't include an evolutionary explanation. So you can test the effectiveness of whether the evolutionary explanation has any, impact on. We may not have the power to test this to figure whether this difference exists with a pilot study, but it's a good framework for testing, lots of different things.
Maybe this can be an idea for a future submission to the College Congress next year. Evolutionary interventions in mental health. I don't know. I mean, that might be a good one. because they can't say it's not clinically relevant anymore, can they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can cite many articles that have, many studies that show the effectiveness of these interventions individually. It's just putting them together, which nobody seems to have done out there, and then test and then frame them evolutionarily.
How much would this need to be by psychiatrists or clinical psychologists? I mean, a lot of this doesn't necessarily involve medication.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends. I'm also wondering,
Yeah.
sort of
Most
trying
of it doesn't involve medication.
No.
So
I'd-
yeah, I'm wondering if like an accreditation process, just like people also train in ICT or whatever, or
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not, you wouldn't need a psychiatrist per se, so the idea is that, it's fairly easy it would be fairly easy to train in, and then it could be fairly widespread, and there could be a version you could do by yourself, if you're motivated or committed enough. But it'd probably be for people who aren't mentally unwell, probably for people who are otherwise okay, and just want to improve their mismatch. So I think
how much can we really improve mismatch? I mean, because we can never go back to being hunter gatherers. I'm thinking of, I've been working with anthropologists for years, especially like the communal aspect, and living every day in a community where people have kind of got your back, and there's a constant bubble of things you have to do together, and you go and share, you get food together and you share food together, and then chat around the campfire. I can see that being easy to replicate in like a camp in the countryside for a week.
Sure.
But then everyone goes back to their isolated homes, and then just the coldness sets in again. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting.
No, I agree. I'm just at the beginning of the idea, but I think even just understanding that my depression could lift a little bit if XYZ was, if these factors were in the right position for me, or if I had some form of community around me that might encourage somebody to, I don't know, join a board game group or something. It could just be a little. I think it reduces the stigma as well, that negative self-talk that you have in depression and anxiety, and if you can demonstrate that. But I think that's the idea. It's reduction. It's mismatch reduction. It's not elimination. We're never going to go back. That's not nice. It's not going to work like that. But you can reduce your mismatch, by a few percent. It could be enough.
Or support groups. I mean, if you could just establish support groups that that already kind of exist, but maybe people won't choose to do them because they don't think it will actually help. And taking that extra step.
And I think the evolutionary explanation adds legitimacy to this endeavor. This is there's a reason we're trying to keep this community alive or keep things going in this way. We're not just working on we're not just working on a study that showed that this is 60% more effective. No, we have evolutionary explanations, going back to when we were hunter-gatherers and reinforcing these ideas.
And if you can get 12 people who are depressed and currently can't work and give them a support group which gives them a bit more energy and allows them to get back to work, then that's, from a public health perspective, that's like a valuable intervention, right? Because you turn people into producers again. So it could actually work out. Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. You should work on it more, and we will. In 5 years' time, I look forward to you being able to present the fully randomized controlled trial across 1,000 participants of different disorders and showing that.
No, this is an idea. It's like a pie. I'm going to present to people. Everyone can have a slice. I'm just here, trying to get this out there. I think I'm gonna put something on the Substack about it. And then try and get some feedback that way. I think that's the best way to try and improve the idea. And then I don't know, maybe your charity could help, could assist in this somewhere along the line.
For sure.
When it gets money. I mean, I think that these ideas also have implications for the design of mental health services and for health services in general. I mean, when I was a medical director, I went down completely the wrong track in looking at more and more subspecializations of services, fragmenting the service and really reducing continuity of care. And I think that is totally the wrong way of designing good health services. We know that we are a species that descend from people or individuals who lived in groups with bonded relationships. Bonded relationships are meaningful relationships. Casual relationships have much less impact than bonded relationships. And I think that to go to your GP or to your mental health worker or whoever it is that you receive care from, I think continuity of care is more valuable in those contexts, both in health and mental health, than the super specialization. With very few exceptions, I think that but nowadays the health service is fragmented. You hardly ever see the same GP twice. You hardly ever see the same mental health worker sometimes twice, because they work in teams and they cover each other and so forth. And I would say that this is to take an evolutionary view and to understand how humans form relationships and how these relationships have a direct impact on health. It has actually implications that are wide and can be applied to many fields. So thank you very much, Gurjot, for your lecture. I just want to make a little announcement for the two future webinars. We have Alfonso Truisi on the 26th of March, and we have Denise Salali on the 30th of April. And the registration links for these two events will be available on the section for evolutionary psychiatry on the WPA website. So thank you again, Gurjot, and good evening.